power, control, fear. For a man like Damien Moretti, these weren't just tools, they were his entire existence. As one of the most ruthless mafia bosses on the East Coast, he controlled everything. Except one thing. Himself. They called him impotent, not just physically but emotionally. A king who couldn't feel. A predator who couldn't connect. The trauma from a brutal attack 7 years ago had left him hollow, unable to experience intimacy in any form. Until the night he crossed a line he could never uncross. Her name was Mia Bennett, his personal assistant for 2 years. Sharp, loyal, brilliant. The only person in his world he almost trusted. She was 28, drowning in medical bills for her dying mother, and targeted by loan sharks who wanted her younger sister. That night, she stayed late in the office and Mia Bennett, the woman who never broke, was breaking. What happened next was a collision of two broken people in the worst possible way. Damien, desperate to feel anything after years of numbness, took what wasn't his to take. Mia, exhausted and vulnerable, couldn't fight him the way she wanted to. By morning she was gone. No forwarding address. No final paycheck. She vanished like smoke. 3 years passed. Damien buried that night in the vault where he kept all his emotions. He never expected to see her again. Then one Tuesday afternoon, Mia Bennett walked back through his doors. But she didn't come alone. She came with 3 children. Triplets. All with Damien's piercing steel-gray eyes. His children. His legacy. His reckoning. The truth he never knew existed. What happens when the past you tried to bury comes back? With interest. Stay until the end to see how Damien faces the impossible choice between his empire and his blood. If you're ready for a story of guilt, redemption, and dangerous second chances, hit that like button now. The 47th floor of Moretti Enterprises was a fortress of glass and steel, where fortunes were made and enemies were destroyed with the stroke of a pen. At 42 years old, Damien Moretti sat behind his mahogany desk like a king on a throne, reviewing acquisition documents that would cripple a rival family's business. After the attack that left him impotent 7 years ago, a brutal assault by enemies who wanted to destroy him in the most personal way possible, he'd rebuilt himself into something harder. Something that couldn't be heard. The intercom buzzed. His secretary's voice wavered with unusual hesitation. There was someone here to see him. Someone claiming it was personal. Damien didn't do personal. He'd cleared his schedule for a reason. When his secretary whispered the name, Mia Bennett, his pen stopped mid-signature. 3 full seconds of silence. His hand trembled, barely perceptible, but there. That name. He hadn't heard it in 3 years. 3 years since the night that haunted every quiet moment. 3 years since she vanished without a trace. The memories crashed back. Mia Bennett had been his personal assistant for 2 years before that night. 28 years old, brilliant, with a mind that could anticipate his needs before he voiced them. She was the only person in his world he almost trusted. That night she'd stayed late again. Her mother's condition was worsening. Medical bills were drowning her. And she just learned her younger sister had been targeted by loan sharks. Mia Bennett, the woman who never broke, was breaking. Damien had entered his office to find her crying silently at her desk, trying to hide it, trying to stay professional even as her world collapsed. Something shifted in him that night. Not desire exactly, something darker. A need to feel anything at all after 5 years of complete numbness. And Mia, vulnerable and exhausted, became the outlet for years of suppressed humanity. What happened wasn't gentle. It wasn't consensual in the way that mattered. Damien's dominance met Mia's initial resistance that faded into exhausted compliance. The aftermath was silence, heavy, suffocating silence. Both of them understanding that something irreversible had occurred. Damien, in his guilt, offered to pay her mother's medical bills and clear her sister's debts. Mia, her voice distant and hollow, told him she quit. By morning she was gone. Damien buried the guilt in the same vault where he kept every other emotion. Or so he thought. Now 3 years later his secretary sent her in. The door opened, and Mia walked into his office completely transformed. She wasn't the timid assistant anymore. Confidence radiated from her like armor. Sharp blazer. Hair pulled back. Direct eye contact that never wavered. But there was something else. Behind her, through the doorway, 3 children approximately 2.5 years old held a nanny's hands. 3 identical faces with steel gray eyes. Damien's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. She didn't sit when he gestured to a chair. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. She addressed him as Damien, not Mr. Moretti. When he mentioned her sudden disappearance 3 years ago, she cut through his words like a blade. She'd left because she needed to. The medical bills he'd wanted to pay? She'd handled them herself. Every cent. It took her 2 years of grueling work, but she owed him nothing. Then she placed a manila folder on his desk. Didn't push it toward him, made him come get it. Inside, medical documents. Paternity test results. Birth certificates. 3 of them. DNA match. 99.99%. The words didn't make sense at first because they couldn't make sense. He was impotent. The doctors had been clear. Physically incapable. And yet here was irrefutable proof that 3 children existed with his DNA. Damien's hands gripped the papers as the impossible became real. He looked past Mia to the 3 children waiting in the reception area. 3 pairs of eyes. The same steel gray as his own. The same sharp chin. The same way they held themselves even at 2 years old, like they were assessing, calculating. His blood. His impossible reality. His voice barely rose above a whisper when he said it was impossible. Mia's response was simple and devastating. Apparently not. Miracles happen. Or maybe he was never as broken as he believed. She didn't have answers. What she did know was that she'd been raising his children alone for 3 years. When Damien asked why she hadn't told him when she found out, Mia's voice hardened into steel. How was that conversation supposed to go? Remember that night you forced yourself on me when I was at my lowest? Congratulations, you're going to be a father? The words hit Damien like physical blows, the first real emotional reaction breaking through his carefully maintained control. She made it clear she didn't come for an apology. That night happened. They couldn't undo it. But those 3 children deserved to know their father, not because he deserved them but because they deserved the choice. When Damien asked what she wanted, Mia's answer was brutal in its simplicity. Nothing. She had a good job. A nice apartment. They were fine. The children's names were Elena, Marco, and Sophia. If he wanted to meet them, he had her number, it was in the file. But she issued a warning that changed everything. He could come into their lives only if he stayed in their lives. No halfway. No using them for image or empire. They were children, not pawns. Then she was gone. The door closed. Damien stood alone in his office, holding paternity results and staring at 3 faces in photographs. For a man who controlled everything, Damien Moretti had just lost control in the most fundamental way possible. The question hanging in the air was simple. What would he do with the pieces of his shattered world? That night, Damien Moretti did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He felt guilt. Real bone-deep guilt that no amount of power or money could wash away. 'Cause Mia was right. That night, he'd taken something that wasn't his to take. And now, 3 children existed because of his worst moment. He called Vincent, his right-hand man, and demanded everything. Where Mia had been. How she was supporting herself. Medical records from the pregnancy. Every detail. By morning, the file arrived, and Damien spent hours reading about Mia's struggles. Working 2 jobs while pregnant with triplets. The difficult birth that nearly killed her. Nights in the hospital with premature babies. Every setback she'd faced alone while he'd been surrounded by luxury. Building his empire. Forgetting about that night. The guilt consumed him in ways he didn't know were possible. 2 days later, he used the number from the file. Met Mia at a park in the afternoon. The triplets played nearby under a nanny's supervision. Damien approached uncertain, vulnerable. The most exposed he'd been in years. Mia sat on a bench, not looking at him initially. When he asked which child was which, she pointed them out with unmistakable pride in her voice. Elena wore a bow and was the most outgoing. Marco was attempting to climb the slide backwards with pure determination. And Sophia, brilliant Sophia, was reading a book at 2.5 years old. The pride in Mia's voice wasn't just love. It was accomplishment. She'd raised these extraordinary children alone. When Damien commented that they looked like him, Mia agreed with a hint of dark humor. Marco had his exact scowl when he didn't get his way. It was terrifying sometimes, she admitted. For a moment Damien almost smiled. Then he tried to apologize for that night 3 years ago. Mia shut him down immediately. She'd spent 3 years processing what happened. Been to therapy. Healed as much as anyone could from something like that. What she needed wasn't his guilt. It was his commitment. Was he going to be their father or the man who wrote checks and disappeared? Damien's honest answer broke through his usual confidence. He didn't know how to be a father. Mia's response was gentle but firm. None of them knew how. They learned. Then Elena ran over. Stopped directly in front of Damien. Stared at him with those steel-gray eyes that mirrored his own and declared he was tall. When she asked if he was Mommy's friend, the weight of that simple question hung between the adults like a guillotine. Mia introduced him as their daddy. Elena processed this with the brutal honesty only a child possessed. "Why haven't you visited before?" she asked. Damien had no answer. How do you explain adult failures to a child? He told her quietly that he didn't know about them, but he was here now. Elena, satisfied with this explanation, asked if he wanted to see her drawing. And just like that, the wall cracked. Damien followed his daughter to the playground, and for the first time in 7 years, felt something pure. Not guilt. Not anger. Something like hope. Over the next 2 weeks, Damien visited regularly. Slow progress. Building trust one awkward interaction at a time. He was terrible at it. Covered in spaghetti sauce when Elena helped with dinner, corrected constantly by Sophia when reading her favorite book, driven to exasperation by Marco's endless why questions. But he kept trying. Kept showing up. And Mia, watching from doorways, saw a man genuinely attempting to be better. Then everything changed. One night, Mia received a phone call from an unknown number. A distorted voice that knew everything. Her name. Her connection to Damien. And most terrifyingly, where her children lived. The voice called them lovely children. Asked if Damien knew what he'd started by bringing her back into his world. She'd made herself a target. And those 3 precious babies? The sentence hung unfinished, the threat crystal clear. Mia's blood ran cold. She immediately called Damien, voice shaking with fear. Someone had just threatened the children. Damien's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The cold, ruthless mafia boss returned in full force. He asked if she was at her apartment. When she confirmed, he told her to lock the doors and not let anyone in. He'd be there in 10 minutes with security. In the criminal underworld, information was currency. And the news that Damien Moretti, the impotent king, had 3 children was spreading like wildfire. To his enemies, those children weren't family. They were leverage. Weapons. Weaknesses to exploit. A rival boss named Viktor Kozlov watched surveillance footage of Mia and the triplets with predatory interest. The king had heirs he'd kept hidden in poverty. Viktor wondered exactly how far Damien would bend to keep them safe. Damien arrived at Mia's apartment with Vincent and 4 security personnel. His orders were immediate and non-negotiable. Rotating security on the building 24/7. No one in or out without being vetted. When Vincent pointed out this would draw attention, Damien's response was ice cold. He didn't care. He turned to Mia, who held Sophia while Elena and Marco clung to her legs, frightened by the commotion. Damien told her directly that she wasn't safe there. The apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up with locks a teenager could pick. His enemies knew about the children. That phone call was a warning. The next move wouldn't be a phone call. Mia resisted immediately. This was their home. Damien pressed harder. He wanted them to move into his penthouse. Secure. Armed guards. Bulletproof windows. A safe room. Everything needed for protection. Mia refused absolutely. She hadn't come back into his life to become his prisoner or charity case. They'd been fine without him and would continue to be fine. Damien's voice rose in frustration. Someone had just threatened to harm their children and she thought they'd be fine? Marco started crying. The raised voices scared him. Both parents stopped. Looked at their son. Damien knelt down, uncertain but trying, apologizing for yelling. Marco looked at him with tearful eyes and asked if bad people were going to hurt them. The question broke something fundamental in Damien. He promised, voice thick with emotion, that no one would hurt Marco, his sisters or his mother. He promised. Then he looked up at Mia with something she'd never seen in his eyes before, fear. Real human fear. He asked her to let him protect them. Not because he was trying to control them but because he couldn't lose any of them. The crack in his armor was complete. Mia saw the truth in his fear. Agreed to 1-week trial basis. But they would do this as partners, not as his subjects. Damien agreed. Partners. The penthouse that had been a fortress of solitude became a home. Damien's cold, minimalist aesthetic was invaded by children's toys, colorful drawings, and constant chaos. The man who'd mastered every aspect of business and crime discovered he was completely outmatched by 3 toddlers. Days passed in a blur of domestic moments. Damien in expensive suits covered in spaghetti sauce. Sophia teaching him to read, correcting his pronunciation with patient authority. Marco asking why to everything until Damien wanted to pull his hair out. Mia watched from doorways, seeing him try, fail, and try again with determination he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. One evening, after the children were asleep, Mia and Damien sat alone in the living room for the first time since that night 3 years ago. Mia acknowledged that he was trying, she could see it. Damien admitted he was failing spectacularly. Mia smiled slightly and welcomed him to the club. That's parenting. In the comfortable silence that followed, Damien spoke about that night. He'd been thinking about it constantly. Mia tried to stop him but he pressed forward. He'd spent 3 years convincing himself he was incapable of feeling anything real. That what happened to him broke something fundamental. But watching Mia with their children, seeing how she'd built a life from nothing, she deserved better than him. Better than that night. He couldn't give her back those 3 years she'd spent alone, but he could try to be better. For them. And for her. Mia's eyes glistened with tears. She admitted something strange. She'd hated him for a long time. But when she held the triplets for the first time, all 3 of them, she couldn't hate him anymore. Because they were half him and they were perfect. When Damien asked how someone forgives the unforgivable, Mia's answer was honest. She wasn't sure she had. But she was trying to move forward. There was a difference. The next morning shattered their fragile peace. Mia received a text from an unknown number. Short. Brutal. They had her sister Sarah. Mia needed to come alone to a specific address. If she told Damien Sarah died, she had 30 minutes. Viktor Kozlov had been patient. He'd studied Damien's new weakness carefully. And he'd found the perfect pressure point. Not the children directly, but the person Mia would sacrifice anything for. Her younger sister. The one she'd been protecting for years. Mia, shaking with terror, grabbed her coat. Damien caught her at the door, immediately sensing something wrong. She tried to lie, claiming she needed to run an errand. But Damien read fear on her face like a book. When he gently but firmly stopped her, asking what happened, she broke. Showed him the text. Damien's response was immediate. This was a trap. She wasn't going alone. But Mia didn't care. Sarah was her sister, her only family before the triplets. There was no time for careful planning. The kidnappers said to come now or Sarah would lose a finger every 5 minutes. Mia was late. Then her phone rang. A video call. On screen. Sarah tied to a chair, beaten and crying. Viktor's voice, thick with Russian accent, addressed Mia directly. She had 30 minutes to arrive at the address. Alone. Or her sister would pay the price. And if Damien was listening, this was what happened when you pretended you could have a normal life. The call ended. Mia was already moving toward the door. Pure panic overriding logic. Damien caught her again, telling her to stop and think. This was exactly what Viktor wanted. But Mia was beyond reason. That was her sister. Damien's words cut through her terror with brutal truth. If she walked into that warehouse, they'd both die. And then what happened to Elena, Marco, and Sophia? That stopped her. The reality crashed down like a physical weight. Mia broke down completely, crying that she couldn't choose between them. She begged Damien to tell her there was a way to save Sarah. For the first time since that night 3 years ago, Damien pulled Mia into his arms. But this time it was different. Protective. Real. He promised there was a way. He asked her to trust him. For once in her life, to trust him. The plan was dangerous. Mia would go in wearing a wire, buying time while Damien and his men surrounded the building. Damien's voice in her ear told her not to engage, not to play hero. Just stall. If something went wrong, Mia whispered, tell the children she loved them. and tell them their father tried to be better. She walked into the warehouse. Dark and cold, smelling of rust and fear. Sarah was visible in the center, still tied to the chair. Victor emerged from shadows, circling Mia like a predator. He appreciated her punctuality. When Mia offered herself in exchange for Sarah's freedom, Victor laughed. What he wanted was to watch Damien Moretti lose everything he cared about. Mia, Sarah, those 3 little accidents he'd been playing house with. Mia's voice stayed steady despite terror. They weren't accidents, they were children. Innocent children. Victor's response was cold. There were no innocents in their world. Mia learned that the night Damien took what he wanted from her. Everyone takes. That's the game. Suddenly, lights flooded the warehouse. Vincent and armed men at every exit. Damien emerged from the darkness, gun in hand, declaring the game over. But Victor pulled a detonator from his pocket. Everyone froze. The warehouse was rigged with explosives. If he died, everyone died. Checkmate. This was the moment that defined everything. Damien Moretti had spent his life protecting his empire at any cost. But empire and family, sometimes you can't protect both. His eyes moved between Victor, the detonator, Mia, Sarah, and his men, calculating probabilities and outcomes like he always did. Then something changed in his face. Resolution replaced calculation. Damien lowered his gun. Told Victor he was right. Victor won. He could have it all, the territories, the operations, everything. Just let Mia and Sarah go. Victor was genuinely surprised. Would Damien really give up his empire for her? Damien's answer, while looking directly at Mia, was simple. He'd give up everything. For the first time in Victor's criminal career, he was uncertain. This wasn't part of the calculation. Damien Moretti didn't surrender. Didn't bow. That moment of uncertainty was all Vincent needed. A single shot. The detonator flew from Victor's hand. Chaos erupted. Damien ran to Mia, shielding her body with his own as his men secured the situation and restrained Victor. When the dust settled, Victor was in custody. Sarah was being freed. And Damien was holding Mia. Both of them shaking with adrenaline and the weight of what almost happened. Mia cried into his shoulder, processing that he'd been willing to give it all up. His entire empire. Everything he'd built. Damien's response was quiet but absolute. It was just an empire. Mia and the children were his family. Natural storytelling pause. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. Built not on guilt or obligation, but on genuine sacrifice and love. Act 3. Rebuilding and new threats. 42:00, 60:00. 1 month later, life had settled into something resembling normalcy. The penthouse that once echoed with silence now vibrated with children's laughter. Damien woke one morning to small hands poking his face. Marco's voice announced it was pancake day. Sophia and Elena were climbing on the bed too, treating their father like a jungle gym. Mia stood in the doorway, smiling at the chaos. Some men are born fathers. Others become them through fire. Damien Moretti had been forged in the worst way possible. Through guilt, fear, and the terrifying realization that some things mattered more than power. In the kitchen, Damien attempted to make pancakes while the children helped. Batter was everywhere. The triplets had strong opinions about technique. They were supposed to be round, not the abstract disasters Damien was creating. When Mia stepped in to rescue breakfast, their hands touched. They froze. The chemistry was still there, undeniable. But it was different now, built on something real rather than a single night of violence and regret. Damien asked her to stay. Not trial basis anymore, stay permanently. Not because she had to, not because he was forcing her. Stay because she wanted to. Because maybe somewhere in all this mess they could be something real. He wasn't asking her to forget or even fully forgive. He was asking for a chance to build something new. For the children and for them. Mia looked at the triplets, laughing and covered in pancake batter. Then at Damien, the feared Mafia boss now wearing a best dad apron the kids insisted on. Her answer was simple, okay. They would stay. They would try. They would see what happens. Damien kissed her forehead with a gentleness that felt like a promise. That evening, children asleep, Mia and Damien stood on the balcony. City lights stretched endlessly below them. Mia asked if he thought it was really over with Victor. Damien reassured her. Victor was in federal custody, his organization fractured. It was over. Then Mia's phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text message containing a photo of them on that exact balcony, taken from a distance. Sniper's perspective. Below the photo, a message that made Mia's blood run cold. Beautiful family. It would be a shame if something happened to them. Consider this a warning. Damien's past doesn't stay buried. Am. Mia's hand shook as she showed Damien. His face darkened with recognition and something deeper dread. Those initials. Am. It couldn't be. Mia asked who AM was. Damien's response was quiet and haunted. Someone he thought died 6 years ago. Someone who had every reason to destroy him completely. The camera pulls back. The city sprawls below. The penthouse stands like a beacon of light against the darkness. A family silhouetted against illuminated windows, surrounded by invisible threats circling closer. They say the past always catches up. For Damien Moretti, the past wasn't just catching up, it was circling, waiting. And it knew exactly where he was vulnerable. The family he'd just learned to love. The children he'd died to protect. The woman who'd given him a second chance at humanity. The question wasn't whether the enemy would strike. It was when. And whether love could survive the storm that was coming. Can Damien protect his family from the ghosts of his past? Or will the life he's building crumble before it even begins? Will Mia's forgiveness hold when new dangers emerge? And who is AM? The shadow from Damien's past that threatens everything. I create stories like this regularly. Tales of redemption, danger, impossible choices, and the thin line between love and obsession. Stories where broken people find each other and have to decide if healing is worth the fight. If you want to know what happens next in Damien and Mia's story, if you want to discover who AM is and what they want, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Part 2 drops soon, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. Drop a comment and tell me. Do you think Damien deserves his second chance? Can someone who committed an unforgivable act truly change? Or should Mia have walked away and never looked back? I read every comment, and your thoughts shape where these stories go. Hit that like button if you stayed until the end. Share this with someone who loves intense, emotional stories. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with a gun. It's the one who knows exactly what you love most. See you in the next chapter. Stay safe out there.